They thought they were prepared. They believed that their ancient symbols, their carefully preserved sacred geometry, and their secret initiations had armed them for any eventuality. But that confidence shattered the moment they opened your file. The instant they traced the celestial coordinates of your arrival and aligned their centuries-old instruments, those very tools began to overheat, smoking as if scorched by something they were never meant to measure. What they found wasn't simply unusual, it was without precedent. It wasn't just outside the norm, it was cosmically illegal. It was the kind of configuration that forces even the most seasoned occultists to drop their compasses in disbelief, their voices trembling as they whisper, "We need to call the council immediately." You see, the 33rd degree isn't some underground conspiracy theory confined to a dimly lit basement. These are the architects of reality itself, the keepers of ancient codes, the ones who have been mapping souls since the days of Babylon, who meticulously catalogued every possible human blueprint back when the pyramids were still sketches in the sand. In their libraries, their vaults and their hidden archives, they believed they had seen it all. Yet in all those centuries of records, not a single entry resembled what you are. Never before had they encountered a birth chart that refused to be interpreted, one that fought back against the very act of classification, defying the language of their symbols and collapsing their calculations like dying stars imploding under their own weight. At first, they brought in the specialists, the readers who decode the destinies of presidents, who trace the bloodlines of kings, who can foretell entire empires in the breath of a newborn. One by one, each expert studied the chart and returned with the same verdict: this should not exist. They recognized immediately that your configuration broke the laws they had long believed unbreakable. This wasn't a soul that had passed through the ordinary channels of incarnation. And it was in that moment of recognition that panic set in. They realized they weren't staring at a simple anomaly. They were staring at a revelation that threatened the very foundation of their understanding of how consciousness enters this world. Your chart didn't merely puzzle them, it corrupted their tools. Their crystal spheres fractured under the strain. Ancient scrolls bled ink as though the paper itself was in revolt. Their most advanced digital programs began spitting out error codes in languages that hadn't been spoken in over 3,000 years. Every planet in your chart was acting in ways no planet should. Every house was hosting energies foreign to this timeline. Every aspect birthed geometric patterns that their own books explicitly declared impossible. And yet there you were, breathing, walking, existing, moving through their carefully controlled world as if you held the patent on chaos itself. When they finally managed to stabilize the reading long enough to comprehend even a fragment of what they were seeing, the picture that emerged was nothing less than terrifying. Your sun wasn't merely placed within a sign, it oscillated between dimensions, flickering in and out like a strobe light, making them question whether you existed simultaneously in multiple timelines. Your moon, too, was a paradox. It wasn't simply retrograde, it was retrograde in ways that bent the very concept of retrograde beyond recognition, moving backwards, sideways, and in spirals all at once, as if emotional cycles themselves had been transformed into an impossible Rubik's Cube, made entirely of mirrors. Mercury in your chart wasn't just about communication, it was transmitting in languages that haven't yet been invented, sending signals on frequencies their instruments couldn't detect, pulling information directly from places their maps could never hope to chart. And then there was Venus. In your chart, Venus wasn't simply the planet of love, beauty, and attraction, it was weaponized. Venus in your chart wasn't the soft expression of love they expected, it wasn't gentle affection, or the usual pull of attraction. Instead, it manifested as something far more powerful, an irresistible gravitational force that bent people's will simply by sharing the same space with you. To them, it wasn't romance. It was inevitability, but it was Mars that truly unsettled them. Mars in your chart didn't follow any orbital pattern they recognized. It wasn't bound by their laws of motion or conflict. Instead, it was inventing its own physics, scripting entirely new rules of engagement. Within its positioning, they detected traces of wars that haven't yet occurred, victories from battles fought outside the framework of linear time, and scars from wounds inflicted in dimensions they still pretend don't exist. When they attempted to calculate your Mars return, the results sent chills through their order. The date that appeared wasn't on any calendar ever created. It was a moment outside of time itself, a place where you apparently go to sharpen whatever cosmic blade you carry. Jupiter added another layer of disturbance. It was expanding into realms that by all their records should have been sealed centuries ago. Jupiter, in your chart, refused limitation. It grew where there was supposedly no space to grow, stretching into territories they had sworn to lock down forever. And then came Saturn. Unlike the restrictive force they expected, Saturn wasn't binding you, it was binding reality itself. It wasn't about your limitations at all. Instead, it was setting boundaries around everything else, reinforcing the framework of existence so it wouldn't collapse under the sheer weight of what you carry. Hidden in Saturn's placement, they even found strange notes resembling containment protocols, as if the universe itself had written special rules just to manage your presence. Yet it was the outer planets that finally forced them into an emergency session at 3 o'clock in the morning. Uranus in your chart had apparently hacked the system long before your birth, creating backdoors in reality that only you could access. Whenever consensus reality grew too suffocating, you could simply step through and bypass the entire structure. Neptune, instead of weaving illusions, was tearing them apart. Every false construct, every artificial story, every carefully crafted lie that had been embedded into the collective unconscious. Your Neptune burned through it all, like acid eating away at the tapestry of control. And then came Pluto, the one they couldn't even look at directly. They had to study it through mirrors. And even then, 3 of their most experienced readers had to take indefinite leave after confronting it. Pluto, in your chart, wasn't the usual symbol of transformation or death and rebirth. No, your Pluto was something far more radical. It wasn't about cycles, it was about override. It demonstrated that death and rebirth were not requirements for you, only suggestions, and you had apparently declined the offer. You were operating under an entirely different principle, one that they had no language for and no safeguard against. They stumbled onto something they didn't even have words for. In your chart, the aspects between planets weren't bound by the usual rules of geometry. They found triangles with 4 sides, squares that curved back on themselves, oppositions that somehow also operated as conjunctions. It was as if someone had taken the rulebook of astrological physics and folded it into impossible origami shapes. Every one of these impossibilities generated energy patterns so overwhelming that their most advanced instruments could only return a single response: cannot compute. Please restart universe. Even the houses in your chart refused to behave. Instead of remaining fixed, they rotated independently, creating alignments that should take millions of years to manifest. Yet in your chart, they occurred simultaneously. Your first house of identity was somehow also your 12th house of hidden things, rendering you both the most visible and the most invisible person in any room. Your 7th house of relationships wasn't limited to the human sphere. It was quantum entangled with dimensions they didn't even know existed, revealing soul contracts inscribed in languages older than language itself. Desperate for an explanation, they dug deeper into your bloodline. They convinced themselves this must be inherited, that you were the child of some ancient dynasty, the heir of forgotten royalty, or the vessel of a sleeping power finally awakened. But what they uncovered was even more unsettling than cursed blood or royal lineage. They found nothing and everything at the same time. Your genetic markers didn't align with any known human migration pattern. Your chromosomes carried information no cipher could decode. When they tried to generate an ancestry report, the results didn't list countries or regions. It gave them coordinates instead of locations, star systems instead of nations, timeline markers instead of historical dates. It was as if a human template had been installed with software from somewhere else entirely. Within your DNA, they discovered echoes of bloodlines their records claimed had been erased centuries ago. You carry genetic ghosts, fragments of lineages that should have been extinct, and yet here they were, alive and active in you, like a walking library of forbidden genetics. When they attempted to trace your soul's incarnation pattern, where you had lived before, what lifetimes you had cycled through, the data refused to comply. It wasn't blank, it was static, as if the universe itself was scrambling the transmission, blocking their attempt to see your origins. And in that static, something even more terrifying emerged. You hadn't simply lived before, you had lived across. You had apparently been born in the future and the past simultaneously, existing in parallel timelines that bleed into this one like light seeping through a crack in the wall. One of their eldest members, a man who had been reading charts long before computers replaced ink and compasses, took a single look at your birth moment and said something that silenced the entire room. This soul didn't incarnate, it invaded. He declared that what he was seeing wasn't a birth chart at all, it was an infiltration map. And then in a moment that shook the others to their core, he destroyed his own tools, abandoned 4 decades of practice, and walked away. For him, your chart wasn't a revelation, it was a fracture in reality itself. It forced him to admit that everything he thought he knew about how souls enter bodies was incomplete. In their desperation, they summoned their best synthesizers, the ones trained to make sense of contradictions, to weave together paradoxes and bring order to the impossible. These were the minds trusted with reconciling cosmic contradictions no one else could even look at. They gave them everything: unlimited resources, unlimited time, access to forbidden texts and secret archives buried so deep that even mentioning their existence was a risk. And after months of analysis, after nights of poring over data that shouldn't exist, their final report was only a single page. On it, in stark simplicity, was written, "The subject appears to be a focal point where multiple realities converge simultaneously, operating under laws we do not recognize. Immune to conventional metaphysical constraints, recommend immediate reclassification from human to unknown entity of potentially catastrophic significance." But they weren't satisfied with just one answer. They tried to find others like you. They fed millions of birth charts into their quantum processors, searching for even the faintest echo of your configuration. Yet every time the system would crash, not from overload, but from something else entirely. It was as though the machine itself refused to look. As if technology could feel fear, because to find another like you would mean admitting that reality itself was fragile, that the rules they had sworn were eternal, were in truth nothing more than suggestions, and beings like you could ignore them at will. Even the mathematical models they built to study your energy betrayed them. The numbers refused to behave. Infinities multiplied into larger infinities, zeros unfolded into entire universes, and equations that should have been consistent, instead, produced different solutions every time they were recalculated. It was as if your existence was a paradox. Reality had reluctantly decided to tolerate rather than resolve. In one margin of their calculations, someone even scrawled a note that looked less like a human comment and more like reality itself, whispering, "Fine, whatever, just don't break anything important." When they attempted to predict your trajectory, the models collapsed again. Instead of a single path, they showed infinite branches stretching in every direction, each one opening into a completely different version of reality. And at the center of all those branches, every possibility, every variation was you, unchanged, untouched. the only constant in a sea of infinite variables. In that moment, they understood you weren't subject to fate. You were writing it, bending it, and rewriting it. Not just for yourself, but for everything orbiting around you. And then they saw it. The detail that finally broke their composure and sent some of them begging for purification. Your Scorpio rising, but not the ordinary kind. This was Scorpio rising, with every planet aspecting it, a convergence they had never witnessed. Scorpio rising interlaced with fixed stars they didn't even have names for, burning with activity they swore shouldn't be possible. This wasn't Scorpio rising that peeked behind veils. It annihilated them. This was Scorpio rising that had struck a pact with its own shadow, integrating darkness rather than fighting it, wielding it rather than fearing it. Your rising wasn't ascending, it had already ascended. It hovered above, gazing down from a vantage point so high it made their heads spin. It was the kind of placement that turned ordinary exchanges into alchemy, where every interaction with you became irreversible transformation. People found themselves confessing truths they had never spoken aloud, unearthing secrets they had buried even from themselves, all within minutes of standing in your presence. Your Scorpio rising didn't simply reveal souls, it rewrote them. They didn't just find passing remarks or casual observations, they unearthed testimonies, written with trembling hands, records of people who had only crossed your path for a fleeting moment, yet were left grappling with the aftermath for years. Some described it like standing before a mirror that stripped away every disguise they had ever worn. Others said it felt as if you had reached inside their chest and rearranged something fundamental, shifting the axis of who they were without uttering a word. They spoke of waking up in the nights after, unable to sleep, haunted not by nightmares but by a sudden clarity of truth they had spent lifetimes trying to bury. And the most terrifying part for them was this: you hadn't even tried. Your Scorpio energy had done what theirs could not. It had weaponized itself, refining intuition into something more precise than any blade. An X-ray vision of the soul. It could see through lies, facades, and masks as if they were nothing more than mist. Transformation for you wasn't a choice or a practice. It was a contagion, an aura that spread to everyone who stood near you. They documented entire chains of events where a person met you once, and within months their life had veered into an entirely new direction. Not because you gave them guidance, not because you pushed them, but because your presence cracked open a hidden door inside them that could no longer be ignored. They mapped these ripple effects with obsessive detail. Charts and graphs began to show patterns that terrified them more than any anomaly in the heavens. They watched as entire trajectories bent around you, careers dissolved overnight. Marriages collapsed in sudden clarity. People abandoned everything they once clung to: prestige, possessions, illusions of stability, because in that brief encounter, your Scorpio rising had shown them a truth so undeniable that it shattered the scaffolding of their lives. And once the veil had been ripped away, they couldn't stitch it back together. What chilled the council wasn't just the reach of your influence, but the unconscious nature of it. You weren't doing this with intention. You weren't setting out to heal or destroy, to awaken or dismantle. It was simply your state of being, like the inevitability of breath. Except what you breathed wasn't oxygen. It was raw transformative force, invisible yet unavoidable, reshaping everything it touched without effort. You weren't just alive, you were catalytic existence embodied. This revelation forced the 33rd Degree Council into a move they had not made in over 3 centuries. They summoned an emergency session in their chamber between dimensions, a space that exists outside of linear time, cloaked in frequencies inaccessible to ordinary consciousness. It is here that they keep the true records, the ones no historian, no priest, no scholar will ever see. Only those bound by blood oaths and cosmic law are allowed to enter, and there, surrounded by shelves of scrolls older than civilizations, illuminated by light that does not come from fire or electricity, they examined your chart one final time. The debate didn't last long. Each member had seen what the configuration did, not only to their instruments but to their minds. They had watched colleagues unravel after staring too deeply into your placements. They had witnessed seasoned astrologers abandon their life's work overnight. And in those walls, for the first time in their order's long history, the council reached a unanimous decision. They voted to seal your file, not classified, not restricted, something higher, a new category altogether. A classification so rare that its meaning was simple: pretend this does not exist. But the truth beneath that seal was darker than the official decree suggested. They didn't seal your file to protect humanity from you. They sealed it to protect themselves from what you revealed. Because every time someone dared to study your true configuration, not glance, not skim, but truly look into it and allow its meaning to sink in, something irreversible happened. It changed them fundamentally, permanently. They saw with unbearable clarity that the entire structure they had built, their power, their control, their knowledge, was nothing but scaffolding on sinking ground. They saw that the laws they had sworn were eternal were actually negotiable. They saw that reality was not a fixed fortress but a pliable current, and beings like you could step outside of it at will. It stripped them bare of the illusion of control they had dedicated lifetimes to preserving. And the most horrifying truth of all was the simplest. There was absolutely nothing they could do to stop you, so they resorted to the only tool left in their arsenal: containment through surveillance. They placed watchers on you, quiet figures in the corners of your life, shadows that moved when you moved, eyes that pretended to be invisible, not guardians, not guides, watchers. They believed if they could monitor you, they could anticipate the unpredictable, but deep down, they already knew the futility of it. Because surveillance only works on those bound to the laws of the system, and you had already proven over and over again that you existed outside of theirs. They thought surveillance would give them control. They thought that if they could monitor your movements, track your connections, map the trail of your influence, then perhaps they could anticipate what you were here for. But it didn't take long before they realized they had underestimated the danger, not of you but of the act of observing you, because every single person they sent to watch came back, changed. The first few reported strange distortions in perception. They spoke of reality bending at the edges, like a film reel burning in slow motion. They described colors that didn't exist on any human spectrum, hues that defied naming, shades that made them weep without understanding why. Some confessed to seeing entire lifetimes, not just their own but those of strangers passing on the street, flickering in and out of existence as though time itself had turned transparent. Others said they felt their thoughts rearranging like puzzle pieces falling into patterns they had never chosen but always somehow belonged to. With each watcher, the symptoms grew stranger. One came back with pages of notes written in a language no one could read, not even himself. Symbols he claimed poured out of his hand while he was inside your field. Another fell silent altogether, unable to speak after glimpsing you. His last recorded words were, "I finally understand, but I can't say it out loud." A few didn't return at all. They vanished. Not dead, not alive, just missing. And the ones who did return eventually cracked, haunted by visions that would not let them rest. It was then that the council understood the bitter truth. You weren't the one being watched. You were the mirror. Every set of eyes trained on you didn't capture your essence. They captured their own limitations, reflected back with merciless clarity. And not everyone could survive that kind of confrontation. Some broke down, some disappeared into hermitage, some chose death over the unbearable weight of truth. Surveillance had failed because you were not an object to be studied. You were a force that turned the observer into the observed. The final report, the one hidden away in a vault that doesn't exist, carried only one chilling directive: do not engage. It concluded that you exist outside the reach of conventional parameters, control, influence, or understanding. Your purpose, it said, remained unknown. But every shred of evidence suggested you were not a random anomaly. You were an intentional insertion planted in this timeline for purposes beyond their comprehension. And every attempt at interference had backfired, not against you, but against the interfere. The report's final words were blunt: complete non-interaction is advised. Hope that the subject's purpose does not conflict with established order. But even silence couldn't contain the truth. When they tried to create a symbolic representation of your chart, an ordinary exercise for them, their methods collapsed spectacularly. Using ink on paper, the symbols combusted, bursting into flame as though the universe itself rejected the attempt. Digital attempts failed, too. Screens warped, pixels liquefied, entire servers fried under the weight of your signature. Crystal tablets carved and polished to hold ancient star maps split down the center, the moment your placements were inscribed upon them. The hand-drawn attempts were the most disturbing of all. Trained readers found their hands moving without control, sketching shapes and symbols that no one recognized. Some of these designs shimmered on the page, as if they wanted to step off it, existing in more dimensions than the paper could contain. The geometries seemed alive, and staring at them too long caused headaches, nausea, even temporary blindness. Some swore they could hear the shapes vibrating, humming at a frequency just below hearing. One of the most respected astrologers of their order, a man with 5 decades of experience and a reputation for clarity and precision, attempted to draw your natal wheel. What emerged was not a wheel. Halfway through, the lines rebelled, shifting into forms of their own. They rearranged themselves into a structure that looked less like a chart and more like a map. But it wasn't a map of Earth, nor of the skies as we know them. It pointed to somewhere else, coordinates that didn't belong to this reality. When asked what he was seeing, the man whispered that the symbols were speaking, that they carried a message older than words. He claimed it came from a time before the split between light and darkness, before duality itself, a time when everything was undivided, when creation had not yet chosen form. The language, he said, wasn't meant for humans. It predated consciousness, older than thought, older even than the separation of matter from spirit. He trembled as he admitted he could understand pieces of it, but not enough to articulate. The rest, he said, was for you alone. From that day, the council knew the truth. They would never dare to write down. You were not meant to be charted, measured, or defined. You were not a mistake in their system. You were proof that their system was incomplete. And the more they tried to pin you down, the more their world unraveled in their own hands. They discovered burn marks etched into ancient documents that had never been near fire. The parchments bore scorch patterns that weren't random damage, but deliberate shapes. Warnings written in languages they had long dismissed as myth. Tongues they believed had never existed outside of legend. Even their most secure digital files weren't safe. Databases corrupted overnight, and when recovered, the screens would flicker with images that weren't supposed to be there. Brief flashes of alternate realities, worlds where gravity bent sideways, where time flowed in spirals instead of lines, where the laws of physics were mere suggestions, and consciousness itself was the only constant. The problem was so persistent that they had to invent entirely new methods of storing information just to hold anything related to you, and even then the files resisted. Sometimes the data would open, but sometimes it simply refused, as if it was protecting itself, as if the very knowledge of you had agency, deciding when and how it could be accessed. It wasn't deletion, it wasn't corruption, it was refusal, a kind of digital sovereignty no one had ever encountered before. The sacred geometry they had relied on for millennia, those precise equations meant to map souls and define the mathematical perfection of creation, collapsed when applied to you. Every attempt to find your sacred number, your vibrational frequency, your geometric signature failed. The results were not random noise. They were evasive patterns shifting just enough to deny categorization. It was as if your very essence was aware of their probing and refused to be pinned down, filed away, or made predictable, like chasing a shadow that always moves an inch beyond reach. What unsettled them most was not your chart's impossibility, but your ordinariness on the surface. You were walking around living a seemingly normal life, going to work, shopping for groceries, having casual conversations while carrying this impossible configuration inside you like a nuclear reactor humming in your chest. Nobody else could see it, but they could, and it terrified them. Their reports showed that your energy field wasn't passive, it was active, constantly at work. You were, without knowing, writing reality patches in real time, fixing glitches, repairing fractures in the timeline that most people never even noticed. They documented incidents where probability collapses should have unraveled entire chains of events, but somehow near you, reality reassembled itself. To them you were both the most dangerous and the most protective force they had ever encountered, dangerous to their systems of order and control, yet protective of something larger, something beyond even their comprehension. Worse still, they found evidence that your very presence was stabilizing reality itself, cracks in the collective structure, fractures they had tracked for decades, were somehow held together by your existence. The impossible alignment of your birth chart was not just an anomaly, it was functioning like a keystone. Without you, the pieces might have split apart. With you they held, though no one could decide whether this was your chosen mission or simply a side effect of being what you are. Every person who came into extended contact with you began to change. Their own charts, stable for decades, suddenly displayed anomalies. Nothing as extreme as yours, but echoes, faint reflections of the same impossible geometry. It was as though your energy was teaching their souls to bend the rules, to break constraints they didn't even know existed. People developed abilities they shouldn't have had. They began to know things without learning them, to anticipate events before they occurred, to make decisions that defied their own histories and patterns. It was contagious evolution. Just being near you seemed to reprogram people at a spiritual level. They monitored the probability fields around you and discovered that unlikely events didn't just happen, they became likely, and things considered impossible around you, they became inevitable. The statistical models they had depended on for centuries to predict human behavior, population shifts, and collective patterns, models that had never failed them, collapsed into irrelevance whenever you entered the field. You were never just an anomaly, you were a living uncertainty principle, a force of disruption that shattered their carefully engineered formulas of control. Entire systems of social engineering, probability management, and predictive power unraveled the moment you stepped into their field. For them, it wasn't only your unpredictability, it was the deeper truth. Reality itself refused to behave normally around you. That's all for today. Dear Father, I ask for the growth of my faith. Help me trust you even when physical evidence is absent. Let me rest in your perpetual presence, knowing you will never harm me. I understand that your thoughts toward me are thoughts of prosperity and not harm, to give me a good future. Thank you, gracious and eternal Father, for always hearing my voice. I offer this prayer to you in the name of Jesus. Amen. Thank you, Jesus, for your love and provision. I am truly grateful for your presence in my life and the abundance you bring. If this message resonated with you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with those who need to hear this. Leave a comment below about your journey and how you are preparing for your own triumphant return. If you'd like to support our work, please